even though I'm going to talk about framing lessons from public health, the title here is more than a message, because this focus on message, while extremely important, is sometimes a huge distraction for us. So I'm going to get into that and tell you why I think that's the case, but also focus on what some of the framing problems are and the struggles are. And it's going to be very similar to, I think, things you've heard from Ellen Jenkins already and what's kind of in the air about framing these days. I think framing got a real jump from George Lakoff a couple of years ago. I think at the first conference there was a buzz in the hallway where people were talking about some framing ideas for the first time, and now the idea is permeating and people are up against the fact that this is a good tool for understanding what's been said, but doesn't always help us as much as we'd like it to when we're trying to figure out what to say. So that's the central problem that I see, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Just so you know who I am, Jason was very generous in his description. You guys can decide for yourself whether I'm a good speaker or not. The Berkeley Media Studies Group is a small project of a much larger nonprofit called the Public Health Institute. We're not a communications group or communications firm. We're a public health group. And as a public health group, we study the news primarily, but also sometimes entertainment and advertising, for how they portray different public health issues. The reason we do that is because when you study public health, you find out that the best way to improve a population's health, not any given individual, but a whole population, the best way to improve their health is to improve the environment in which they live. Now, and I mean that environment broadly. It could be the social environment, the physical environment. We have an environment in this room, for example, that has no smoke in it, because if you want to smoke, you have to go outside. That improves the health of everybody, smokers and non-smokers in this room. And that's a public health approach to thinking about the conditions in which people live and improving those as a way to get to individuals, rather than going one at a time and saying, you know, you really shouldn't smoke, and you really shouldn't smoke, and you really shouldn't smoke. And, you know, there's a little bit of that too. That's important. But the biggest effect comes from changing the environment. So if that's the case, if you really want to change environments, you want to change the way the world is structured and the systems that govern the way the world is structured, then you have to talk to policymakers, because policymakers are the ones making the rules. They're making the rules in institutions like hotels that have policies about whether you can smoke or not. They're making the laws at the local level, the state level, the federal level. So if you want to fix environments, you have to talk to policymakers. If you want to talk to policymakers, then you have to pay attention to the news, because of course that's what they're paying attention to. So that's what brings me as a public health person to an interest in news and news coverage, and how are those issues being covered. So when we study it, we want to know if the only way a person got information about this topic, whatever it was from the news, what would they know? And, very important, what wouldn't they know? That's usually what's missing from the frame. So that's why we study the news. And then we take that and apply it to media advocacy training and strategic consultation with public health advocates, which is really a lot of what's going on at the conference here, what the progressive PR we would call media advocacy, because we understand that it's not just a bag of tricks or tools, that it actually has a social justice basis that has to do with rectifying equity in our society and speaking up when there are things going wrong and there are whole populations suffering from it. And so that's the basis of media advocacy, using the tools of public relations with the basis in an understanding of how these issues are framed in the news. And then the third thing we do is a little bit of work with journalists to help them understand the public health issues of that, public health aspects of the issues that they're reporting on. And most of our work in that area has been in violence prevention and trying to help reporters rethink the way they cover crime and violence. So I can talk about that a little bit, but I'm not going to focus on that. What I'm going to focus on is why message is never first, and then what the implications of framing are. Message is never first, because before you go talk to somebody, you have to know, what is it you want to change in the world? What is it about that environment that's going to make the population healthier, or the group satisfied that you're trying to, whose demands you're trying to satisfy? So what is it that you have to change exactly? And then, how will you change it? What has to be done? You can't start talking about it till you know those two things. And then, the most important, not the most important thing, but another important thing that we tend to leave out sometimes is why. Why do you want that change? Why does it matter? Who cares? So those things have to be lined up before you can go out and start talking to people about it. Then you can. And even when you're talking to people about it, this is more than about persuasion. This is more than about changing people's minds. And in fact, it's never really about public opinion. Most of the time, public opinion is already with us. Here's an example. It's a pretty old example. It's from 2001, but there are lots of others. This is an example of what the public thinks about one public health issue, handgun licensing. The people who are trying to reduce gun injury and death think that handgun licensing will help restrict the number of firearms, which in fact will reduce that number. So that's their strategy, that's their analysis. You might agree with it or not, but in any case, what they're trying to do is get handgun licensing. So they wanted to know, is the public with us or against us? And they did a poll, Lake and Associates did the poll for them, and what they found out was that the population is overwhelmingly in favor of handgun licensing. The bottom graph shows you that 83% of the voting public thinks that we should license handguns just the way we license cars, or drivers, I should say. And even if you go deeper in, you find out that 3/4, 71% of gun owners think we should have handgun licensing. And 2/3 of NRA supporters think we should have handgun licensing. Do we have handgun licensing? No, we do not. Good. Who said that? Yeah, they know. Good, yeah. We don't. So this is about more than public opinion. Something else is going on. So before you can go into that, you have to figure out what is it you want to happen. You have to know your overall strategy. Then you can start talking about a media strategy. And there's a lot of workshops you've been going to yesterday and today that focus in on the different aspects of the media strategy and how to take advantage of that. Then you can focus in on message, very simple. What are you going to say? Who's going to say it? And who are you going to say it to? And then you can figure out how can you get access to reporters. That's the thing that Jason's really good at. And that's the thing I think that's the fun part of all of this. But sometimes people leap to there too quickly. They call us up at BMSG and say, can you help us get news coverage for whatever? Can you help us think this through? And we say, maybe our first question is always, why? Why do you want news coverage? And they say, you guys are the Berkeley Media Studies Group. Don't you think this is a good idea? And our answer is always the same. It depends. It depends what you want to do. And it depends whether your strategy and your policy is thought through. And there's a lot of thinking through to do on that. I don't know if any of you saw this last Sunday in the New York Times, but there was a fabulous little article that described some of the background strategizing between Martin Luther King and LBJ before the Voting Rights Act and before the Civil Rights Act. And there was conversation in a classic inside-outside political game about what the strategy on the policy side was and how the media coverage and the actions and the demonstrations could dovetail with that. This wasn't by accident. People figured out their strategy ahead of time. So that's all I'm going to say about that. We're going to go on to framing and messaging and talk about the media context because that's what I study and that's what I'm here to talk about. But it has to be applied within a context. It's very important. This is a fascinating article. It has the conversation that was taped between the two of them, so I recommend it if you guys are interested. So we have to think about the policy context first and what's going on there. The next thing we have to think about is the media context. And whatever message we develop in whatever context, it's going to be, in our day and age, it's going to be heard in some loud, messy, overstimulated media environment that is controlled mostly by corporate interests who have something to sell. And frankly, we just can't compete with that. We don't have the dollars to compete with that in that way on their own terms. So we can't use advertising. We can use advertising, and it's an important thing to use, but we can't use it in the same way. In public health, that is an argument we often have because people think, what if you could just, what if we could do what Coca-Cola does, but just tell people about good behavior? and learn how to use all their techniques and brand our message in that way, and figure out how to get the right message to the right person at the right way at the right time so they'll do the right thing. And that works with some people. You can do that a little bit. But even if you do that successfully, you'll only have a small audience because you can't be heard over this din of advertising. And so that's problematic. And it also means it's problematic on the policy side because there are messages coming out through advertising that shape the way politicians think about companies as well. And companies take action to say that they're doing the right thing when in fact we know in the case of alcohol, tobacco, and food, guns as well, sometimes housing, lead, there's lots of companies that have profited at the expense of people's health and have used the media to their own advantage, as in this case. So what's going on in food right now, an issue that we're paying close attention to, is that the companies are feeling kind of under attack, which is interesting because there's really only a small group of people who are saying they're doing anything wrong, but they're feeling it. And they're feeling the pressure of the recent data that shows increases in diabetes and among children, which is a terrible problem and something we need to do something about. So they're saying, well, we're doing something, and we're going to use our power in the media to do something about it. And I don't know if last summer you remember when Shrek came out, but a lot of kids did, and the companies took advantage of that, and they said, you know, we're going to use Shrek, and we're going to use that sponsorship that we can do with Shrek, and we're going to tell kids it's important for them to exercise, and they're doing the modern thing. They've got a website, and the kids can go online, and then they can do their 10 jumping jacks, and they can do 5 sit-ups with Fiona. And so, you know, that's not such a bad thing. Kids need to do sit-ups and jumping jacks, and I'm glad that the companies think that's important. Unfortunately, that's not the only thing they're doing. The other thing they're doing is everything they can to sell their product. So this is the cereal that Kellogg's put out that was sponsored by Shrek. So that's a very confusing message to a kid when they're doing their sit-ups with Fiona and then they're down the cereal aisle and mom has to explain why no, they can't have the Shrek cereal. That's too hard. Mom's job is hard enough as it is because mom probably knows intuitively that this is a bad combination because if you wanted to burn off the calories from one bowl of Shrek cereal, you'd have to perform 2,100 jumping jacks. I think, yeah, 10 was what they were recommending. Okay, so we have a problem here. We have a problem here. So we are overwhelmed by advertising. We can't use it just to get out a message to say if we made better choices about our health, we'd be a healthier society. That's probably true, but that's not how we're going to get there. So if it's not advertising, what are we going to do? I think that we have to turn to news because news is where the policy clout is. I think for you guys, this is an obvious choice. I think when I'm talking to a public health crowd, it's hard for them to understand why they have to abandon advertising and move to news, but it's extremely important that they do. Because we know that news sets the agenda for what topics are important, for what we talk about, for what pile of things on that policymaker's desk she turns to. That's driven in part by what's in the news. And then it's not just what we talk about, it's how we talk about it. And that's where the framing comes in, and that's important. This isn't about news for news' sake, because how the issue is discussed is important. So I want to give you an example of that. And this is an example of an old campaign from a group some of you might know, the Breast Cancer Fund, which has become extremely sophisticated in its recent campaigns. I don't have an example of the recent campaign, but I can tell you about it a little bit. But this is a very old one I want to give you an example of. This is a picture of Andrea Martin, who started the Breast Cancer Fund and died several years ago from her breast cancer. And she started a media campaign in San Francisco. On the bottom left corner of that news article, which says the headline, you see a sight to shock. The bottom, the headline is "Graphic Breast Cancer Ads Taken Down." And what you see on the bottom left-hand corner are reproductions of the ads, and they were like imitation Victoria's Secret catalog cover and imitation Cosmopolitan magazine cover with a model on the front, as you see, but exposing a breast cancer scar where a breast would be. And these ads went up on bus shelters in San Francisco. And they caused quite a stir, as you might imagine. And the pull quote there says, "We wanted to challenge the cultural treatment of women, their breasts, and this disease." And they did break through the media din. They got attention. But what was the conversation about? The conversation was about whether the ads themselves were obscene. This is a political cartoon from the San Francisco Chronicle showing a person waiting at the bus shelter where an ad is depicted on the side, thinking, oh, shocking. And of course, the political cartoonist is saying, give me a break. How can you say that's shocking when we've got sex shops and topless bars in San Francisco? So the political cartoonist is commenting on the irony of what the debate ended up being about. It wasn't until Ruth Rosen published an op-ed that said, wait a minute, it's the lack of treatment for breast cancer that's the problem, that's obscene here, not these ads. And look, the San Francisco Chronicle got to print those really interesting images again. So the images are important. They help put the story in the paper. But initially, the Breast Cancer Fund hadn't thought through the outcome, where it wanted to land. It knew it needed more attention, but attention for what? And how will this be discussed? And that's why framing's important, because as you heard from Alan, the frame sets up the parameters about what's possible. The frame institutes the idea of where the logical conclusion is from where we go. And we have cultural frames in our society already that are setting the direction for where we ought to go, that from my perspective in public health are holding us back rather than leading us forward. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about how frames work, and then what the problem with the default frames are, how they hold us back, and maybe what some hope is for moving a little bit further forward. So there's lots of definitions of frames. This is one that I've been using lately, and it's longer than I would normally use, but you know, here you guys are, you have to listen to me for an hour, so I'm going to give you the whole definition. The first thing, it's sort of a three-part definition. And you know, it depends where you go in academia. People define frame differently. If you go to history, if you go to psychology, if you go to cognitive linguistics, political science, they all define psychology a little bit differently. For my money, it's about how people extract meaning from text, whether that text is a picture like they saw in a bus shelter, whether it's something they read, something they hear. It's about how people extract meaning and how that meaning intersects with what's already in their heads. Because what we've learned from the framing research is that there are no blank slates. Nobody walked into this room with an empty brain. You all came in with something. So the frames are the mental structures that help people understand the world based on particular cues from outside themselves that activate assumptions and values they hold within themselves. Mental structures that are part of the architecture of your brain, if you're a linguist, that are based on cues and stimulus you get from outside that activate ideas, ways of thinking about the world, and values. What's important is that you come with stuff already, and the stimulus connects to that. So let me give you an example of how that works. Show me, tell me out loud, what's it say behind that blue box? Oh, say it loud, come on, you're awake now. Okay, there you go. Except not so much. So, look at that, is that cool? Oh, I just love this. You guys have seen this before, huh? So, look what your brains did. They took something that was just a cue, just a hint, and your brains know the alphabet so well, they just filled in the blanks. That's how frames work. A little cue stimulates something in your brain, and your brain fills in the rest. This is a two-part operation. Your brain in this instance was wrong. But right here, it was telling you that said true spin conference. That's what happens with frames. That's how they work. The question for us is, are we putting out the right cues? Because the way we cue things is going to trigger some ideas as opposed to other ideas. And that's what we have to think through, and we have to think if those ideas we're triggering are going to lead to the logical conclusion of the policy we're seeking, because that's the foundation, that's where we're headed. And one of the ways we use cues is words. And the message. So that's why the message and the framing thing sort of come together and get thought of as the same thing when they're not. The words are important, but they're not the only way you set the frame. But here's an example of how important they are. This is an old survey that was given, the same survey in 2 different ways, all scientifically done, so it's pretty interesting comparison here. And I'm going to read you what it says. I'm going blind. I can't see it on my own little computer here, so I have to look over here. It says, this is from the New York Times, January 2000. They were surveying the public about what we should do with the surplus. Remember the surplus? Anybody remember surplus? Okay. It says, should the money be used for a tax cut? This is the first way they ask the question. Should the money be used for a tax cut, or should it be used to fund new government programs? Now, when they asked the question that way, 60% said tax cuts. Then they tried it another way. They said, should the money be used for a tax cut, or should it be spent on programs for education, the environment, health care, crime fighting, and military defense? And when they asked the question that way, only 22% said tax cuts, 69% said programs. So the words matter. Now, Larry Wallach and I have a debate over why this is so. Larry says it's because in the first question, they say government. And, you know, that's the kiss of death. Nobody likes government anymore, despite the fact that government is simply the way we pool our resources so we can do things together that not one of us can do alone. That's all it is. That's all taxes are. It's simply a way to pool our resources so we can do things together. Of course, we don't think of it that way, so that's Larry's argument. My argument is that, well, Larry might be right. He's been right a few times. But the second one is that in those few words in that second question, education, health care, military defense, there's a little something for everyone, first of all. And second of all, it's more descriptive. It's just saying in just a couple words, what does government mean? Sometimes that's all we have to do. We need a few words to say what we mean. Because if we don't, then we don't know what we're cueing in people's brains. And in fact, we're likely to be cueing the opposite of what we intend, simply because of the cultural soup that we swim in this society. The most dominant frame in our society, the most dominant story we tell ourselves about ourselves, is the story of rugged individualism, personal responsibility, the idea that if you try hard, you can succeed. It's a fabulous story. It's a wonderful story. You know, my parents, when I was growing up, told me that I could be anything I wanted if I tried hard. And now I'm doing what I want. They have no idea what I do for a living, but they know that it's what I want to do. All right? It's a wonderful story. The problem is it's not the whole story. And the flip side of that story, the story that comes with it, you can't have one without the other. The flip side is that if you don't succeed, it's your own fault. These two things come together. They cannot be disengaged. That's because they're part of the same frame. The logic exists that links them together. So we have this wonderful story about ourselves that runs very, very deep. The metaphor, I don't have to tell you, I can say bootstrapping and you know what that means. Our computers boot themselves up. They start from nothing and become something. The metaphor runs deep. So it doesn't take anything to cue it. It's already in our brains. The problem with it is that it so overemphasizes personal responsibility, it masks the other values we hold and the other stories we have about ourselves. We don't just tell ourselves stories about rugged individualism, even though we get those pounded into our heads over and over again, mostly through television, through newspapers, through entertainment. That's why the scale is out of balance here. Most of the research on news shows you that the meaning that people take from stories emphasizes personal responsibility. I think Alan talked to you about episodic and thematic framing. Is that right? Nod your heads at me if I just want to see if you're awake, but yeah, okay, good, all right. So this is how I think of it. For me, it's like the difference between a portrait and a landscape. If you have a news story that is focused in tightly around a person or an event or something that happened the way news stories do, and then you show that story in experimental situations to people and ask them afterwards, what should we do about this problem? Whatever was depicted, it could be crime, poverty, war in Iraq, it could be anything like that. And then you ask them what should we do? They will answer in ways that tend to blame the victim. That is extremely problematic from a public health point of view because we know environments are what shape behavior. So people have responsibility, absolutely. We need more personal responsibility, particularly in high places. So it's not that responsibility isn't important, it's just not only personal responsibility. So if you study the news, you find two things. The first thing you find is mostly stories that are shaped like portraits or framed like portraits. That's why the scale is out of balance. About 80% of television news is framed that way. That's the first thing you'll find. The second thing you'll find, though, is that there are other types of stories. There are stories where the frame is pulled away from the portrait. It still might include a person or an event, whatever that news hook was that made the story happen. But the frame is expanded, so it includes just a little something else. Something about the background, something about the context, something about the consequences, something besides whatever happened to the person. We're not talking about dissertations and we're not talking about documentaries. We're talking about news stories, a minute, 20 seconds, that are still thematic. It's more like a landscape than a portrait. So in that 20% of news that's like a landscape, when you show people those stories, and then in the same experiments ask them, well, what should we do about this problem, whatever was depicted, then they answer in ways that include institutions and government as part of the solution. That's what we're seeking. We're talking about a shared responsibility here. But that is just harder to cue in our society. We hold those values. We hold the values of interconnection and community and the things that tie us together. We know in our hearts that taxes are really about pooling our resources so that we can provide clean water to people and get rid of dirty water and build bridges where we need to have bridges and get people public transportation and have libraries. We know that that's what it's about, but that's not the first thing that comes to mind. It's just harder to bring up those images. But they're deeply held as well. I mean, think about a barn raising, for example. You know, a barn raising, the community comes together, you bring the hot dish, you put it on the table, you grunt, you work all day together, you push, you do something together, you have a barn. You have a barn where none was before, and you did it together. And why do I have to reach back into the 19th century to get an image of community working together? It's there. It's hard to cue. We don't talk about it as much. It's hard to revive. If we want to frame things to help people understand why the policies we seek matter and matter more than just to the immediate beneficiaries of those policies, we have to talk about that. We have to say why it matters. People will hear that because most people hold many frames in their head at once. It's just a matter of what is cued. So this little piece of survey research demonstrates that. This is from the New York Times. It's a report of a survey that said, reported on a question that was posed this way. It said, the question was, success in life is pretty much determined by forces outside our control. Do you agree that your life is determined by forces outside your control? Well, the blue folks disagree with that, and the brown on the bottom agree. So what this chart tells you is that if you live in the United States, Canada, Japan, Venezuela, or Great Britain, most of the time, most of the people think, no, no, no. It's not forces outside my control. I control my destiny. It's my choice. I decide. I can be anything I want in this world. If I work hard, I can get there. I'm going to use my initiative and effort. Initiative is what we're good at, and if you don't succeed, it's your own fault. Remember, those things come together. Now, not everybody believes that, because you see both colors in all the countries. But if you live in France, Egypt, Kenya, Mexico, Russia, Brazil, Germany, Italy, China, South America, Turkey, Pakistan, some country I can't read, and Bangladesh, then most of the time, most of you believe, no, there are forces outside my control that are determining what's possible in my life. So these are the frame battles. On every issue, there's going to be particulars and specifics. But in general, these are the two core frames that battle. And the thing that we want to do, if we want people to understand the policy's value that we're promoting, is we have to cue the frames so that in their brains, what they bring forward is activated. And so the questions for us are we giving people the right cues? How can we cue that environmental perspective of the world as opposed to that narrowly focused portrait? How do we cue the landscape? And what values do we activate? I think George Lakoff actually gave us my favorite thing from George is this conceptual levels idea. I know he's done a lot of stuff, and some I like and some I argue with him about. But the thing that I like the most is this three-level idea. His idea is that there are these conceptual levels that people think in and talk in, and one has to do with the values level. And those are the big values: fairness, responsibility, duty, obligation to help people who are in need, the kinds of things that people care about deeply, the kinds of things that make you do the work you're doing instead of going off to make more money someplace else. Those things that motivate you. That's level one. That's the thing we tend to leave out in our messages when we talk, as we think about how to structure the ideas we're trying to express to people. It doesn't mean the whole thing we say has to be about values, but it means they have to be included so that we cue in people the frame that can accommodate the solution we're seeking. The second level is the issue level, like housing or children's health, living wage, that sort of thing. That's very interesting as well from a framing perspective, because that helps people see issues in new ways. So for example, when we talk about violence as a public health issue, as opposed to a criminal justice issue, that allows us to bring prevention into the conversation in a way that a criminal justice conversation doesn't allow, or a law enforcement conversation doesn't permit. So thinking about how you frame things is agriculture and health issue. Only recently, only this year in the debate over the Farm Bill have health groups started to wake up and realize that yes, indeed, agriculture is a health issue. So safety, health, education, how do these things fit together? That's what level 2 is. And then level 3 is about the nitty-gritty. It's about the strategies. It's about who has to do what on Monday. And when I started out with the overall strategy, that's what I was talking about. You have to know what it is you want to change in the world and how you're going to change it. What is your community organizing strategy? What is the policy advocacy strategy? That has to be very well worked out. And because it requires so much attention and work, sometimes when we're delivering a message and talking about it, we stay there. And that's our inside baseball conversation when we're too deeply in the center of it. And what I think these 3 levels helps me see is that we can't just stay there. We have to include the values level. And when we do that, we're going to reach more people. We're going to activate and cue that part of their brain that understands that there are values other than personal responsibility. So this is not easy to do. In fact, this is extraordinarily difficult to do. And it takes a long time to do, and it takes practice to do. And there's no easy way, and each issue has to be rethought within this framework every time. The closest we've been able to come to thinking this through is, or having sort of a formula for how to think this through, is what we call framing for content. We call it framing for content because it means how we're framing. We're not framing for getting access to reporters. That's different. That's when you have to pay attention to what constitutes newsworthiness and what attracts a reporter's attention. And that's a whole set of ideas that you want to link ultimately to the frame that you're going to end up landing on in terms of how you're going to justify your policy. But it's a little bit different. That framing for content is about what do you say after you have their attention? What do you say after you have the reporter's attention? So you have to do these things. First, you have to translate the individual problem to a social issue. You have to be able to talk about why it affects more than just a few people, and you have to talk about why it's an issue of community concern, or of the whole neighborhood, or of the whole city, or whatever region it's of concern. You have to assign primary responsibility. Who has to do what, and what is it they have to do? That's when you present your solution. And then you have to advocate for that solution. So all the work you do to frame a message isn't going to do you much good if the message isn't well delivered. And that takes practice and discipline. And then finally you have to develop story elements, and that relates kind of to getting access to journalists. What pieces of the story are you going to tell? If you go back to that breast cancer fund example, they had a fabulous visual. A visual is a great story element. It just wasn't used in the best way until Ruth wrote that op-ed that linked it to the policy outcome. So think about this little rubric here in terms of tobacco control for a minute, because I like to think about tobacco control because the work that we all do is so long and hard and difficult, and it seems like it takes forever to get a win, that I like to look at something that I've seen change in my lifetime and think, yes, indeed, something is possible. Now, I used the example when I opened up that there's nobody smoking in here. And of course, were we meeting, 40 years ago, that would be different. Maybe even 30 years ago. Maybe even 20 years ago. But there has been a profound change in our society. The air used to belong to the smoker. Now the air belongs to the non-smoker. Now, this has been a long time coming. This didn't happen just like that. The first study that linked lung cancer to tobacco was published in the 1920s. The first Surgeon General's report saying, yep, tobacco and heart disease and cancer, these things are linked, was in 1964. So this didn't happen fast, even though now it's hard to imagine people thinking of the tobacco industry as a regular corporate good guy. But believe me, people did. So what did the tobacco control folks do? Well, first of all, they translated the individual problem to a social issue. Nobody says smoking anymore when they work in the field. They say tobacco. The difference in just the meaning of those words, smoking and tobacco. If smoking is the definition of the problem and you assign primary responsibility, who has responsibility? Smokers do. What's the solution? They should stop smoking, and we in public health should do everything we can to help them stop, and that's what we did. And then you would devise story elements about, oh, this cessation program and how it worked, and don't get discouraged. It takes 3 or 4 times to quit. We know it's really addictive. Yeah, heroin user, it was harder to quit smoking than stop heroin. Yeah, so, there were news stories about that. Okay, now, if the problem is tobacco and you assign primary responsibility, who's got responsibility? The tobacco companies and the government that regulates them. What's the solution? Well, the tobacco control people came up with all kinds of solutions. We already talked about clean indoor air laws. They got rid of vending machines that kids had access to. They did all kinds of work to try to get billboards down. They raised the price of tobacco, the single most effective way to reduce consumption, both for tobacco and alcohol, is to raise the price. That's what excise taxes are all about. And then those excise taxes funded programs that then allowed people to have media campaigns and use advertising and all of that. But the policies in this instance came first. And the education was done in the context of news, because when somebody went to that city council meeting and said, we should have an ordinance here that says no smoking in public buildings, somebody said, why? And they had to say, because this is an issue that affects health, and health is important to us, and it's important to all of us. The question that you can think of to help yourself move the frame out from the individual portrait to the landscape and think about how to push that so it's a community concern, is to think about the issue, whatever it is, and then ask yourself, how does this affect people who aren't in the immediate circle of whatever that policy is that is going to be enacted? Let me give you an example. That was a little complicated. We did a lot of work on early care and education for a while, and the people who work on that issue know that quality child care makes a difference, not just for the families that benefit, for the individual kid who's going to do better in school as a consequence of that, and who's going to do better in life because they've had that socialization early on, and they know what it means to sit in a group and be read to, and they know what it means to interact fairly with their peers in a classroom, and they get all that in preschool. It's not just good for the children, it's good for the whole society. They're not working so hard on this issue just because they want these kids to have good educations and go buy BMWs. They know that this benefits our very democracy because it's the foundation of the society we're building. But that's not easy for them to say out loud or think about without practice. And one way we made them practice is put them in a room and say, give them a piece of paper that said, quality child care that's subsidized by the government benefits people without children, after all. And then you have to complete that sentence. And that's not an easy thing to do, but that will help you get to the point where you can make the case. So the tobacco people have done this very well. They've moved from the individual frame that focuses on personal responsibility to the social frame, the institutional frame that focuses on the environment that impinges upon what individuals do. And I'll show you one more example of how we tried to switch a frame like that in a different issue, and then I'll stop talking so we can have a conversation about this. The examples I'm going to show you is kind of old, but you know, I like it, so there you go. This is a story from the Oakland Tribune, my hometown paper in California, and this is an old story. It's from '94, I believe, and you can tell it's an old story because the headline on the left side says, "Violence up across the state." So we haven't seen that in a long time, but in the early '90s, we were seeing it all the time. And we had just begun to work on violence prevention, and so we were really happy to see this story on the front page of the Oakland Tribune, because it was placing the issue of violence in that important context. It wasn't about a particular story of crime. It wasn't about just an individual action. It was about the context, what was happening, policy was implicated, this was important. But when we turned the page, we saw this jump headline that said, "Crime, juveniles blamed." Now, there was a technical reason that wasn't incorrect. The biggest jump in crime had been between 15 to 19-year-olds, but it was a very inappropriate headline in our mind. One, it blamed youth, when in fact we know most young people aren't violent. I usually have to say that twice. Most young people aren't violent. The reason I have to say it twice is because the images we see, we know from our studies of the news, is that kids are associated with violence in the news at the same rate they're associated with education. Yet Most kids are in the education system, and hardly any kids are in the criminal justice system, even though it's a problem we have to solve. So there's a very big distortion that blames youth, and that was a problem here. So we wanted to, you know how it is when you see something in the newspaper and you get riled up, and that's when you write your best letters to the editor, right? So we wanted to shake our finger at the Oakland Trib and say, bad Oakland Trib, don't do that anymore. But, you know, we know that we don't want to waste our media exposure just to chew out the Oakland Tribune. We want to think about our overall strategy, what we're trying to achieve in the world, connect any media exposure we get to both the policy we're trying to achieve and expanding the frame from the portrait to the individual. Now, if you want to do that, if you want to expand the frame from the portrait to the individual, you can do that in many ways and land anywhere, because there's a lot of different things we could do to prevent violence. The initiative we were working on had 3 particular things that it had identified as the most important solutions at the time in California. And there were big policy agendas for each of these, and community organizing and policy advocacy associated with them. I'm going to give you the soundbite version of what they were. The 3 policy areas were fewer guns, less alcohol available to young people, because we know that alcohol is like throwing gasoline on a fire when it comes to violence. And the 3rd policy area was shifting resources to prevention. We just wanted 2%, a measly 2% of the prison budget to go to prevention. Fewer guns, less alcohol, more resources for prevention. Those were our policy goals. Those were our strategies. Everything in our media that we were paying attention to in the media advocacy was focused on those 3 policy goals. At the same time, we want to take that frame around the portrait and the individual bad actors in crime, because of course if kids shoot other kids, they absolutely should be punished, no question about it. But of course, we have a responsibility to create an environment where that is much less likely to happen. So we want to have our 3 policy goals in mind, expand the frame from portrait to landscape, and then get some news attention. So here's the letter to the editor that we sent to the Oakland Trib. It's headlined, "Kids Unfairly Blamed for Crime." I'm just going to read you one paragraph. It says, "Too often, youth are scapegoated and cast aside. The children of Alameda County do not manufacture firearms." Policy goal number 1. "They do not sit on planning commissions that allow alcohol on nearly every inner city street corner." Policy goal number 2. "They did not take the actions that increased classroom size and reduced the school budget. When kids are killing kids, that tells us more about our society than our children." In a few sentences, do you have a picture of that environment? Have I cued something other than just personal responsibility here? So it can be done. You can bring a picture to mind, but you don't want to bring just any picture. I could have talked about housing. I could have talked about overcrowding in schools. I could have talked about mental health services. There are many, many things that we could do that would help prevent violence in our society. The things that we were working on at that time and in that moment were those things. So that's what we wanted to cue. Let me show you another example. This is from the New York Times. It is a story about binge drinking, which is a big problem on college campuses. We were invited to different college campuses to work with the folks there to help them figure out how to reframe what they were talking about and get news attention. And every year the study comes out, it's about every 2 or 3 years, an updated study comes out that talks about binge drinking rates on college campuses. And this one I can't remember what year it is, but the headline says, "Effort to curb binge drinking in college falls short," so it's still a problem. And then the pull quote says, "There's more heavy drinkers, but there's more abstainers too," so that's sort of the research findings. But here's what the president of Iowa State University said when she was asked about it. She said, "Of course, students who drink too much must be responsible for the problems they cause," said Ms. Coleman. "But students are not responsible for manufacturing and marketing alcoholic beverages. Students are not responsible for the excessive number of bars within walking distance of our campuses. Students are not responsible for the price specials that encourage drinking to get drunk. Do you know what it looks like around her campus? Do you know what her idea of what some of the solutions are from just a couple of sentences? And has she expanded the notion of responsibility for solving a problem? That's what we need to do if we're going to reframe. We have to develop story elements that make the landscape as vivid as the portrait. We have to illustrate our values, not that we dwell on them, but that we include them in stories. And we have to connect the values to specific solutions. If we get better at this, we'll get better at everything. And I think we'll get more of the people who have to make the decisions interested in the solutions that we're seeking. We don't need everybody. There's no situation where we need 100%. There's only a couple times a year we need 50% plus one. We never need everybody. But what we do need are the people who agree with us. And they're only going to come if they recognize that they agree with us. They're only going to see it if we state our values. And we help them link the values they share with us to the solutions that we've identified that are the next step in solving these very, very difficult problems that are going to take a long time, just like tobacco, to work on.